A line was crossed. A relationship once considered the most stable, boring, and dependable in the global economy fractured, perhaps irrevocably. This isn't a story about some distant diplomatic skirmish you can afford to ignore while you drink your morning coffee. This is a story about the structural integrity of your job, the sticker price of your next vehicle, and the fundamental economic security of an entire continent. It explains how a quiet, simmering dispute suddenly exploded into a full-blown economic firestorm that has left wreckage from the Rust Belt of Ohio to the manufacturing heartland of southern Ontario. To understand the magnitude of this disaster, you have to look at the before picture. Picture this. On February 9th, 2025, the North American steel industry was a humming, perfectly integrated machine. It was a testament to decades of cooperative cross-border trade. Iron ore mined in Minnesota was shipped to blast furnaces in Hamilton, Ontario. That steel was rolled and sent to stamping plants in Michigan. The finished parts were assembled into cars in Ontario and sold back to consumers in New York. Steelworkers in Ohio and Ontario were, for all intents and purposes, colleagues on the same team, separated only by a line on a map that goods flowed across freely. But by the very next morning, they were cast as rivals in a brutal, zero-sum economic conflict. A single announcement from the White House tore the rulebook to shreds, and the special relationship between Canada and the United States evaporated in the heat of a blast furnace. The war began officially on February 10th, 2025. There was no summit, no negotiation, and no warning. On that day, the U.S. administration announced it was not only reinstating, but dramatically expanding the controversial Section 232 tariffs. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 is a nuclear option in trade law. It allows the president to restrict imports if they are deemed a threat to national security. For decades, the idea that Canadian steel, used to build American tanks, fighter jets, and critical infrastructure, was a security threat to the United States was considered laughable. Canada is a NORAD partner, a NATO ally, and the closest strategic friend the U.S. possesses. But on that Tuesday morning, the logic changed. The White House declared a blanket 25% tariff on all steel imports from every corner of the globe, explicitly eliminating all previous country-specific exemptions. The administration's message was blunt. Effective March 12, 2025, Canadian steel would be treated exactly the same as steel from China, Russia, or Brazil. It was now a foreign commodity, a hostile import subject to a heavy tax. The stated logic from Washington was to protect American jobs and bolster domestic production capacity. And, in the immediate aftermath, it seemed to work, at least for a select few. Shares of major U.S. steelmakers like U.S. Steel and Cleveland-Cliffs surged instantly. Investors poured money into these companies, anticipating a windfall of protected profits. They cheered the America First steel policy. However, the market's initial euphoria ignored a fundamental physical reality. Canada is the single largest buyer of American exports and a top supplier of the specialized steel and aluminum the U.S. economy depends on. The two economies are not just neighbors, they are Siamese twins joined at the hip. Auto parts, steel beams, and construction materials flow back and forth across the border up to 7 times during the manufacturing process. While steel stocks rallied, the broader market, the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, dipped. Smart money sensed the danger immediately. This wasn't protectionism, it was self-mutilation. The United States had just declared economic war on its biggest customer. For decades, Canada's response to American trade aggression had been polite, diplomatic, and measured. Ottawa would usually send a delegation to Washington, hold meetings, and wait for the Americans to come to their senses. But this time was different. The unilateral removal of the exemption, justified by national security, was seen in Ottawa not just as a policy shift, but as a profound betrayal of the alliance. Just one day after the U.S. tariffs took full legal effect, on March 13, 2025, Canada unleashed a retaliatory package that shocked the White House. The value of the package was staggering. surtaxes on up to 29.8 billion Canadian dollars, roughly 20.7 billion US, worth of American goods. The centerpiece of this retaliation was a surgical, dollar-for-dollar targeting of the American steel industry. Ottawa slapped a punishing 25% retaliatory tariff on $12.6 billion of U.S. steel imports and another $3 billion on U.S. aluminum. The message from Prime Minister Mark Carney's government was brutal and unprecedented. You target our steel, and we will cripple your industry's access to its most vital export market. But Canada didn't stop at steel. In a move designed to inflict maximum political pain, the retaliation list targeted agricultural products from key American political swing states. Suddenly, bourbon from Kentucky, dairy from Wisconsin, and apples from Washington state were facing massive duties at the Canadian border. Ottawa was no longer playing defense. It was trying to break the political will of the U.S. administration. Instead of de-escalating or seeking a negotiating table, Washington doubled down. On June 4, 2025, feeling the sting of the Canadian countermeasures, the White House escalated the conflict to a level that trade economists described as insanity. The U.S. raised the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 25% to a crippling 50%. A 25% tariff is a hurdle. A 50% tariff is a brick wall. This rate was designed not just to discourage trade, but to annihilate it. At 50%, no amount of currency fluctuation or efficiency gain can make the math work. For Canadian plants in Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie, this was an existential threat. Blast furnaces that cannot export cannot run. And because steelmaking requires continuous operation, you cannot simply turn a factory off and on. You either run it or you wreck it. The costs began to spiral out of control immediately. U.S. corporate profits for fabricated metal manufacturers, the companies that buy raw steel to make screws, beams, and car parts, fell a staggering 30% between late 2024 and mid-2025. They were paying double for their raw materials, while their foreign competitors were not. As the federal governments traded blows, the conflict turned local. Ontario, Canada's manufacturing heartland, and the province most exposed to the steel war, entered the fray with a ferocity that caught Washington off guard. Premier Doug Ford, realizing that thousands of jobs in his province were on the line, threatened to use every lever available to the provincial state. The rhetoric shifted from trade policy to economic warfare. Ford floated the idea of surcharges on electricity sold to the U.S. grid. Ontario supplies significant power to Michigan and New York. Cutting that cord or taxing it would cause havoc in American cities. Furthermore, the province threatened to end sales of American alcohol at the LCBO, Liquor Control Board of Ontario, one of the world's largest single purchasers of alcohol. Overnight, multi-million-dollar contracts for California wines and Kentucky bourbons were on the chopping block. Ontario also moved to ban U.S. firms from provincial infrastructure contracts. But the most terrifying threat was whispered in the corridors of the mining sector: nickel. Ontario and Canada control a massive portion of the strategic nickel reserves required for electric vehicle batteries and stainless steel. There was talk of weaponizing control over these strategic resources, restricting exports to the U.S. defense and auto sectors. If Canada turned off the nickel tap, the American EV revolution would grind to a halt. By late 2025, the impact was catastrophic on both sides of the border. The integrated machine of February was now a smoking ruin. In Canada, steel production dropped significantly. Manufacturing employment shrank by close to 10,000 people in July 2025 alone. These weren't just statistics. These were families in Hamilton and Windsor losing their livelihoods. In the U.S., the downstream industries got hammered. The automotive sector, which relies on the seamless movement of metal, faced production disruptions. Canadian-made vehicles, which contain U.S. steel, now faced a 25% U.S. tariff upon re-entry. This double taxation squeezed profit margins to the breaking point. A Ford F-150 built in Dearborn using Canadian steel was more expensive. A Chevy Equinox built in Canada sent to the U.S. was taxed at the border. The price of new cars spiked, adding fuel to the inflation fire the U.S. Federal Reserve was desperately trying to fight. American agriculture was also caught in the crossfire. Farmers, already struggling with weather and global prices, found their largest export market, Canada, walled off by retaliatory tariffs. Just when the conflict seemed to settle into a bloody stalemate, Canada launched a strategic shift aimed at long-term independence from the U.S. market. Ottawa realized that the United States could no longer be trusted as a reliable partner. The goal changed from resolving the dispute to divorcing the partner. On December 26, 2025, Canada imposed a 25% tariff on steel derivative products, like wire fasteners, nails, and industrial mesh, from all countries. This was a defensive move to prevent cheap foreign steel from being dumped into Canada, while its own mills were struggling. But the real dagger came a month earlier. On November 26th, Canada announced that remissions, waivers, for using U.S. steel would expire on January 31st, 2026. For years, Canadian manufacturers could get a waiver to import specific types of U.S. steel tax-free if they couldn't find it domestically. By canceling these waivers, Ottawa forced Canadian companies to find new suppliers immediately. It was a forced re-engineering of the supply chain. Canadian firms began signing contracts with suppliers in Germany, Sweden, South Korea, and Brazil. They were aggressively erasing the United States from their vendor lists. This is the permanent damage that tariffs cause. Once a Canadian manufacturer retools their factory to use German steel and signs a 5-year contract with a European mill, they do not come back to the American supplier just because the tariff is eventually lifted. The market share is gone forever. The headline figure of 12 billion vaporized that began circulating in financial papers is not a single stock market drop. It represents the intersection of two destructive forces. 1. Canada's initial 25% tariff placed a bullseye on over $12 billion of annual American steel exports. This was the value of steel the U.S. sold to Canada every year. By applying the tariff, Canada rendered this steel uncompetitive. American mills lost their biggest customer overnight. 2. It also represents the cumulative damage to Canadian exports to the U.S. In sectors like structural steel and aluminum, exports dropped by nearly 40% in single months. This value didn't just move elsewhere. In many cases, it simply vanished as construction projects were canceled due to high costs. The vaporization refers to wealth that was destroyed by inefficiency. It is the cost of factories running at 60% capacity. It is the cost of construction sites in Toronto and New York sitting idle because the price of beams blew up the budget. It is the sound of economic activity grinding to a halt. Amidst this chaos, a major geopolitical event underscored the weakness of the U.S. position. The protectionist environment facilitated the $14.1 billion acquisition of U.S. steel by Nippon Steel of Japan. Why did this happen? Because the U.S. steel industry, protected by a 50% tariff wall, became a bloated, high-priced island. U.S. steel stock rallied on the tariff news, making it an attractive target for foreign capital looking to buy its way inside the wall. Nippon Steel realized that the only way to sell to America was to be American. While politicians cheered the tariffs as saving U.S. steel, the reality was that the company was sold to a foreign competitor because protectionism had distorted its value. The tariffs didn't save the company's independence. They merely fattened it up for the sale. In any war, there are beneficiaries, but in a trade war, they are few and far between. The winners. Companies like Cleveland-Cliffs and Nucor. Protected by 50% tariffs, they were able to raise their prices on domestic customers without fear of Canadian competition. They saw short-term stock gains and record margins. Steel mills in South Korea, Europe, and Brazil, which stepped in to fill the gaps as the U.S. and Canada stopped trading with each other. The losers. The auto sector. Faced with rising costs and supply chain chaos, they slowed production and raised prices. The consumer. From washing machines to pickup trucks to canned soup, everything made with metal got more expensive. The alliance. The intangible trust between Washington and Ottawa was shattered. This was more than a trade dispute. It was a rupture that redefined the economic landscape of North America. It exposed the fragility of integrated supply chains that everyone assumed were immortal. While the immediate firestorm may eventually subside, the structural damage is done. Canadian companies have diversified away from the U.S. American companies have lost their best customer. The just-in-time efficiency of the Great Lakes economy has been replaced by just-in-case hoarding and suspicion. As the review of the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, approaches in 2026, the question remains whether this economic partnership can ever be fully rebuilt. The steel tariffs proved that in the new era of economic nationalism, even your closest friends are fair game. The border is no longer just a line on a map, it is a battle line, and the casualties are piling up on both sides.